Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Eleanor Harvey. I'm the Senior Curator at the Smithsonian American Art Museum and the Curator of the exhibition Alexander von Humboldt and the United States, Art, Nature, and Culture. We're so happy that you can join us for another of our webinars from our symposium that was planned for the opening of the exhibition. And I think you are in for a great treat today. Our speaker is Dario Robleto, who is a transdisciplinary artist, researcher, writer, and teacher based in Houston, Texas. Throughout his 25-year career, Dario has sought to cultivate rigorous, mutually transformative interactions between the arts, the humanities, and the sciences, making him the perfect speaker for a series on Humboldt. He's exhibited his work extensively since 1997 at museums such as the Menil Collection in Houston, Texas, and the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York. His work has been profiled in numerous publications and in media, including Radiolab, Krista Tippett's On Being, and in the New York Times. He's been a visiting scholar and artist in residence at institutions such as our own Smithsonian Museum of American History, the SETI Institute, the Robert Rauschenberg Residency, and the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University. In 2015, he joined the distinguished team of scientists as the artist consultant for Breakthrough Message, a multinational effort that aims to encourage intellectual and technical debate about how and what to communicate if the current search for intelligent life beyond Earth is successful. He is currently serving as artist at large at Northwestern University's McCormick School of Engineering and the Block Museum of Art. In 2016, he was honored as the Texas State Artist Laureate. And in 2020, he was a research consultant to a popular science television series, Cosmos, Possible Worlds, which aired on National Geographic and Fox. That lineage from Humboldt's Cosmos to Carl Sagan's Cosmos to Neil deGrasse Tyson's Cosmos is another thread that pulls Dario along and makes him the perfect person to be talking to us today. Dario, I'd be happy to introduce you and to hand this over to you.
Thank you, Eleanor. Let me just get my screen ready. Well, yes, good afternoon. And Eleanor, thank you. I'd actually like to begin thanking you in more detail and just telling you how much I've enjoyed our friendship over the years. And I hope everyone got a chance to see Eleanor's talk. And if you didn't, I highly recommend it. And, you know, I think everyone that knows Eleanor realizes she has this great combination of intelligence and passion, and makes learning really contagious and just draws you in deeper and deeper. And I've learned a lot from you, and I really value our friendship. So thank you. I also want to thank Andrea Wolf. I don't know if everybody got to see her talk, but I also hope you will. The author of a book, biography on Humboldt. And I can't, as others have mentioned, I really can't believe how many times reading her book that I kept asking myself, why don't I know more about Humboldt? Especially, I would think I would. I'm sort of primed to know more about him, and yet he's kind of a non-factor in my education. And I was particularly taken with the way she opens the book about literally tens of thousands of people celebrating the centennial of his death in 1869 in Africa, in Asia, in Australia, the Americas, and in Europe. And it really struck me that why don't I know the scientist who could elicit such passion from such a diverse body of people, literally across the world. And this stung me a bit because I am a bit of a history buff, and I actually really enjoy learning the lineage of the interconnection between art and science. And so this bothered me that I didn't know more about this person who I now clearly see has laid the intellectual framework for much of my attitude about art and science today. But I think the fact that I don't know more about him and the way we are taught or not taught between the arts and sciences about each other's fields, I think actually says something pretty important that I want to talk about today. So here he is, the famous Alexander von Humboldt, a naturalist and explorer, one of this last real polymaths. I love this painting by him. But as I read on in Andrea's book, and another thing I thought she did so excellently was connect him through other thinkers through time, people like Darwin, Thoreau, Haeckel, and how his ideas, the seed of his ideas, were kept alive through this intellectual lineage. And then someone very important to me, as Eleanor mentioned, Carl Sagan and his wife and co-writer Andrian, who are responsible for the incredible television series Cosmos. You definitely can see the seed of his idea weaved through these incredible people. So I want to say that, in no way am I an expert on Humboldt, but I really have committed my life to, and I do have something to say about the core ideas that he ushered into our intellectual horizon. And although I will lay out this general overview of Humboldt to connect him to my work, I won't spend a ton of time on his broader life, and that's why I really highly encourage you to watch Eleanor and Andrea's talks to really flesh out the complexity of this mind. But for today, what I'd like to lay out is Humboldt's central insight between science and art in his own time, and how the core of that idea has shaped my work. So in my attempt to kind of briefly summarize Humboldt's work, this towering mind that would probably be insulted by brevity, here's what I take away as his sort of central message. We are bound together. For Humboldt, the separateness or otherness that we feel in relation to nature is really this illusion that crumbles away once we can actually observe the complex cycles of exchange and regeneration that are occurring at the scale of the planet, the whole globe, or the cosmos. And I'm very fond of this quote by Humboldt. I think it beautifully explains this point. He writes, "In the Amazon forests, as on the peaks of the Andes, I had the feeling that the same life infiltrates stones, plants, and animals, as well as the swelling breast of humankind, all animated by a single spirit from pole to pole." This is really a beautiful, soaring observation that connects, as he's saying, connects all processes and matter together. And crucially, for an artist reading that, what really stands out is he doesn't try to hide the poetic aspects or the spiritual-like aspects even that are embedded within the scientific pursuit. And this core holistic approach to life and the natural world, this idea that everything is connected, it's one that we kind of take for granted today, and in some sense, we could say it's even a bit of a cliche, but that should really never blind us to the fact of just how radical an idea this was at the time. Even as Andrea points out in the title of her book, someone had to literally invent the concept of nature as we would understand it today. And for Humboldt, it is Humboldt who gave us one of the most enduring metaphors of the last 200 years, this idea of the web of life. So just think for a second of what that core metaphor has done for us. It is a metaphor that's turned into action. It's demanded an expansion of ethics and altruism. It's even demanded new forms of humility and stewardship and care for the natural world. And it changed our sense of a moral responsibility to the future as we conceived of the future or the planet we would want to leave our children. Essentially, his idea is the backbone of one of the most consequential ideas of the 20th and 21st century, which is environmentalism. And that idea is going to be core into the centuries ahead as well. So with this central insight, Humboldt's legacy was secure, and it definitely helps me better understand why tens of thousands of people would line the streets to celebrate his life and legacy. But what's really important is that Humboldt went further. And it's this next point that I really want to celebrate and which resonates the most with me. So for Humboldt, there was no distinction between art and science. For him, the scientific pursuit, the scientific inquiry into physical reality was not in tension with art and the poetic. In fact, and here's really, I think, the exclamation mark on his idea, it's the opposite. Science that doesn't embrace its poetic and emotional dimensions, and art that doesn't grasp the beauty and enchantment of a scientific understanding are both impoverished in the process. And again, as an artist thinking about these things, I hear something very provocative. I feel that he's challenging scientists and artists to do the difficult cross-disciplinary work in bridging knowledge. And there's another little nuanced point here I want to stress, that Humboldt's argument was not one against specialization. You know, he was not against botanists doing botany or chemists doing chemistry or sculptors sculpting, but instead his argument was for the integration of all knowledge, especially if we were going to have any chance at an accurate accounting of the true complexity of reality. So in this thought, I also want to just briefly nod to Goethe, one of Humboldt's contemporaries and most influential collaborators who helped refine these radical ideas on art and nature. Goethe called the merger of scientific observation and personal reflection delicate empiricism. And this really elicits every kind of goosebump in me. I honestly can't think of anything I'd rather be called than a delicate empiricist. But Humboldt, in his delicately empirical ways, was making his argument precisely at a moment when science was trying to distance itself from subjectivity, sentiment, and emotions, as if these were somehow contaminants to objective truth. And I think it's important to say too that the arts and humanities were also becoming quite suspicious of science's increasing insistence that reductionism and measurement were the only valid forms of truth. And these suspicions would eventually help shape the very sharp lines between the sciences and the arts, between the subjective and the objective. But Humboldt's core ideas never vanished. It's just that there was this major shift occurring towards specialization without attention to integration. So for as Humboldt saw, and a point that I've also spent many years of my life pondering, measurement is not a synonym for meaning. You know, another way of saying this is that he understood that there was a distinction between what is and what matters. And he insisted on the role of emotions and the imagination in understanding the true complexity of life and experience. He saw that no matter our noble ideal of objective, dispassionate truth, we are subjective beings with minds designed to search for meaning between our inner and outer worlds and to look for purpose in a purposeless universe. And instead of subjectivity being this kink to work out of our overall pursuit of knowledge, he argued that art and poetry, like math and physics, are forms of knowing that should be held in equal regard. So as an artist such as myself, you know, arguing for the equal legitimacy of art and the pursuit of knowledge seems so obvious as to not really need repeating, but as I have learned firsthand over many years, this argument for the collaborative value of art and science must be restated, championed anew, and I think very importantly, it must be updated for the times. So Humboldt's core idea has remained alive, if somewhat dimmed over the past 2 centuries. But we can see the spirit of his thoughts weaving, as I said earlier, weaving through many great works through time. Walt Whitman kept a copy of Humboldt's masterwork Cosmos on his desk while he wrote his own masterpiece, Leaves of Grass. And you can hear this radical spirit of the possibilities between the poetic and the scientific in one of my favorite lines from Whitman. Every atom belonging to me, as good belongs to you. It is science that reveals the structure of the atom, but it is art that insists on its humanity, on the ethics embedded in such knowledge. And I'm very fond of this quote by Charles Darwin, who would of course do so much in his own regards to enrich our understanding of the connection of life through deep time. And he writes, "I formerly admired Humboldt. I now almost adore him. He alone gives any notion of the feelings which are raised in the mind on first entering the tropics." And this may seem a touching but slight remark, but there's a lot going on here. You know, we see here, like in Humboldt's quote from earlier, there's this open acknowledgement of the role of subjective feelings working in parallel with the analysis of hard data. And we hear in Darwin's remark, not only how rare it was to openly express such sentiments, but a true longing for the reconciliation between poetry and science. Whitman and Darwin are just a few of the connecting points that lead to today, but we have a big question to ask here. Why continue in this Humboldtian spirit of integration between the arts and sciences? For example, as a culture, you know, we've largely decided that our arts and humanities departments will be on one side of our university campuses and our science departments will be on the other. Things seem kind of sorted out and comfortably sectioned off. And in many cases, there's an outright hostility between the arts and sciences. And I try to keep up with all the competing reasons as to why. And I often wonder what Humboldt would make of how these things have played out. But here I'd like to transition and share a few background points about my own practice that I hope illuminates how and why a contemporary artist should be engaged with science today. So the first thing I'd like to point out is that for me, not unlike Humboldt's idea, art is for me more of a worldview, this philosophy of disciplinary integration. As much as it is an adherence to any particular medium like painting or sculpture or ceramics. And my sense of curiosity has always been very broad, with many passions pulling me in many directions. Even, I would say, I've actively resisted specialization at this point. And in this sense, for me, the category of art functions more like this umbrella term for someone who decided to just pick all their passions at once and deal with the consequences. And although this maybe sounds like someone with ADD, I like to think it's a bit more purpose-driven than that. And this has really led me to believe that my obligation is to all knowledge and every method possible to obtain it, whether reasoned or imaginative, methodical or speculative. So with this idea that art is a philosophy of disciplinary integration, a model that I have found very useful in doing this type of work is what I call embeddedness. And, you know, we're all familiar of the concept of the embedded journalist, and we don't really need much explanation as to the cultural relevance of that mode of observation. But I found it's a very useful idea to me, literally in the sense of embedding myself within the fields of sciences that I'm studying, and which leads to a third point, while also drawing on the ethical lineage of bearing witness, because I also believe strongly in the value of poetic and artistic critiques to provoke, refine, or illuminate deep ethical concerns at the heart of science. And this idea of embedding and witnessing allows me to refine one of the most difficult aspects of doing this type of work, which is choosing where and why to begin a conversation with science. There's, you know, just the general principle and joy of reaching across a disciplinary line and learning. But I like to be more refined and specific so that I can really make the case that there is an essential reason for this collaboration to occur. An argument that certain revelations are only possible through this collaboration. So the scientists I tend to work with are ones that meet certain criteria. Specifically, what I am looking for are examples of thought or technological developments that I would argue are so big that they transcend their field of origin, rippling out across multiple domains of knowledge, often without the originators realizing this because they're so focused on their own field. And then to really make the case that there's simply no way to truly understand this phenomenon unless we collaborate across disciplines. And finally, in the spirit of Goethe's delicate empiricism and the attention to feelings that Humboldt and Darwin mention, I'm also deeply interested in the emotional knowledge of the scientists that I work with, because they are often working at the front line of new types of emotional experiences that, if explored properly, I think can really be a source of new creative methods. But as I have learned, they are often not allowed or encouraged, at least publicly, to explore this side of their work. So with emotions and feelings in mind, I'd like to share some research on a project with you that I really hope honors Humboldt's argument for the integration of the arts and sciences. So over the past 10 years, I have really given myself over to knowing the heart. And whether through science, art, religion, or philosophy, I don't care, I just want to know it all. Every incremental step we've made through time. And like Humboldt's metaphor of the web of life, for an artist to be interested in the heart is almost this kind of eye-rolling cliche, but also like the web of life. There is a reason the metaphor of the heart has stood the test of time and is worthy of constant updating. There is a reason we have centuries of poems and songs written about the heart and not the liver, kidneys, or lungs. Because historically, it was the heart through which our imaginations probed the deepest questions of humanity. In many ways, the heart, I would argue, is the perfect vessel to ponder Humboldt's insights, because just like the eventual segmenting of human knowledge that so deeply concerned Humboldt, the heart would also go through a dramatic severing, also split between poetry and science, between metaphor and mechanics. And I believe when we consider the stunning current day scientific developments occurring within the science of the heart, the severing of poetry and science really puts us at a disadvantage when engaging with these latest breakthroughs. So in the broadest historical strokes, the heart was split in two by competing interpretations of its function and its meaning. On one side, you had the religious interpretation that argued that the heart was the literal vessel of the soul and identity, this conduit between the immaterial and material realms, and the literal home of one's emotions and free will. And today, this ancient argument about where one's identity resides in the body or one's consciousness has largely moved up to the brain. But for much of history, this was a question for the heart. And think of how much we still use these ideas day to day. When we fall in love, we give our hearts to each other. To be authentic or honest is to wear our hearts on our sleeves or to have hearts to hearts. If you are religious, salvation is often couched within your God, knowing what's in your heart, and so on. But because the heart was considered a sacred vessel, and at some level infallible and supernaturally designed, it took centuries for it to be thoroughly studied scientifically. And even then, these studies were always done on autopsied bodies or in animals. And even then, these studies were quite controversial at the time. The technological capabilities to study a living heart just had not been developed. It was literally impossible to cut into someone's chest without killing them, for example, and religiously speaking, even if we could have done this, it would have been unheard of to poke around in or even look upon a living human heart because of its assumed divinity. But once science got involved, everything changed. And with massive medical, philosophical, and cultural consequences, upending the debate about where one's soul and identity is located in the body. Da Vinci's famous studies and drawings of the heart started to reveal its mechanical-like processes, suggesting that it was nothing more than a complicated pump and there was no need for supernatural explanations. The secularization of the heart would continue for centuries, with each new revelation about its function convincingly suggesting that not only could we study it, but we could alter it. We could perform surgery on it, and most radically, we could replace it when it malfunctions. And it is here that I want to point your attention to heart transplantation, a phenomenon we have mostly absorbed into culture, but which I still think clearly demands a collaboration between science and art to fully understand. So to do that work and better understand the contemporary divide between the scientific and poetic heart, I've been in collaboration and conversation with a number of heart surgeons and researchers. I've witnessed heart transplants in both humans and animals. I've interviewed many transplant recipients, and I've done a number of artistic studies on the latest artificial heart technologies. But I want to tell you, even with those years of work and preparation, nothing quite prepared me for the awe that is the ghost heart. This incredible thing that you're looking at, it was invented by Dr. Doris Taylor of the Texas Heart Institute. And it is one of the most intellectually and emotionally complex objects I've ever seen in my life. To try to overcome the lingering global problems of heart disease, organ transplantation shortages, anti-rejection drugs, and the still pretty limited reliability of artificial hearts, she asked a very provocative question. She asked, can we regrow our hearts again? And to this end, she has invented a way to literally wash our hearts clean of all of their cells, revealing something never seen before: the heart as a matrix, as pure form. In fact, as an artist looking at it, one of the most provocative questions she has inspired in me is to ask, has she discovered the fundamental form of the heart? Like the logic of a seashell, this extracellular matrix is the substance cells secrete to give themselves a home. Without this bioscaffolding between the cells, they would not know how to align with each other, failing in their purpose to keep us alive. And like much great art, Dr. Taylor has given form to something hiding. The heart shell is in every one of us right now. And her hope is to one day repopulate this heart architecture with the patient's own cells and watch it grow back into a fully functioning heart. And here's a short video of her testing its structural integrity. And I want to say one more time as you watch this, this would be your heart. It would be made of your cells and DNA. And it would open up a mind-bending era of giving our own hearts back to ourselves. And I'd like you to just ponder the complexity of what you're seeing here. A disembodied heart that had a history, now washed clean of all of its cells, reduced to pure form, hovering in space as it is made to beat again. And although Dr. Taylor is driven by the most noble and humanitarian of concerns, there is the poetic and cultural facing side of the ghost heart that really must be thought through. So as history has shown us, each time we tinker with the pure mechanics of the heart, we inevitably provoke deep-seated philosophical, spiritual, artistic, and even ethical questions about the soul, emotions, and life and death, all things that we like to think we've pretty much resolved. It is not a coincidence that the first generation of spouses who watched their partners receive heart transplants asked them if they still love them after surgery. We can dismiss this as trite or misinformed or overly sentimental, that the heart is really nothing more than a fancy pump, but as an artist, I would tell you that that is a big mistake. For it is in these spouses' concerns that millennia-long questions about identity and recognition, intimacy and emotions are playing out again. And this is not a trivial matter. The way we understand our hearts, the metaphors we build to express the most complex aspects of our being have real world consequences. As Humboldt would say, everything is connected. How we understand the biology of the heart and how we understand the intertwinement of emotions at the site of the heart is connected to the types of intimacies that we can imagine and to the creation of new poetic forms that give meaning to our lives. If we are about to enter an age of ghost heart exchange, an age where a 50 or 70-year-old person can carry within them their newly reborn heart again, then I would argue we are at one of these moments that I mentioned earlier, a scientific development that has transcended its field of origin, and it needs a healthy conversation with the arts and humanities. For there is really an opportunity here to critique, if we choose to, or expand the behaviors and metaphors we use on how we relate to and care for each other. And in this next image, all my hopes for such collaborative contemplation are on display. When unexpectedly, Dr. Taylor asked if I would like to hold the ghost heart, a huge leap of trust to an artist by a scientist that had no real scientific value for her to do so. I knew that we had crossed this threshold that I am always I'm striving for, between a level of trust and respect between our disciplines. And as I adjusted to the surprising weight of this elemental form, she began pointing to vascular features that I would have missed otherwise, and I couldn't help but to ponder what the Egyptians would have made of the ghost heart. This was a culture that left the heart in mummified bodies because it was needed to enter the afterlife. Its lightness of weight signaling one's worthiness into the afterlife. And as I held and sat with the ghost heart, pondering all it might one day be, I felt obligated to reflect on what it had been. And as I watched it beat, I was overcome with mourning and loss. But for what exactly? This person was gone, their cells now literally washed away. They had donated their body for important scientific reasons to save other lives. And yet, did something remain of them? Had Dr. Taylor found the material edge of identity, that boundary line before we are indistinguishable from dust on the breeze? Dr. Taylor's ghost heart, I would really argue, demands new ways of thinking about identity and form, life and death, rejection and recognition. So as part of our collaboration, we have taken this conversation on the road, so to speak, and to date, we've held 3 public events speaking about the poetic and scientific implications of her work. And this is, I put this up because it's a very important part of what I do as an artist, as I really believe that these collaborations should have a public-facing side to show how these types of conversations can proceed. But Dr. Taylor has inspired much more from me. In particular, it is this deep reflection on the boundary line of identity at the site of the heart that has informed a series of works centered on the central question: what do we owe to the memory of each other's hearts? And one way to respond to this question, I believe, lies somewhere in the deep history of 2 images that we rarely reflect on anymore: the pulse wave and the flat line. These are really such simple things, a line moving over time, pretty inconsequential images until it is your loved one whose heart is being registered on a monitor. But like the entire history of our quest to understand the heart, in particular our quest to record its invisible actions, there's a lot more going on here. And so for the past several years, I have investigated the cultural and technological history behind the quest to record the living human heart, while also trying to find new ways to deepen empathetic and ethical bonds to these types of historical data. So first developed as a visualization of the beating heart, the pulse wave really was a revolutionary form of scientific inscription that, like I mentioned earlier, has become this routine marker of health and medicine. But at its inception in the mid-19th century, it also held the potential for radical new possibilities of attunement, tenderness, reciprocity, and empathy. essentially it opened up a new way of knowing another's heart. And I think it still holds that possibility today. So the first instrument to capture a human pulse wave was developed in 1853, using, incredibly, a stylus made of a single human hair to trace an oscillating white line into a micro-thin layer of soot that had been gathered from a candle flame on a piece of paper. The invention of the pulse wave would revolutionize medicine, inaugurating cardiology in the process. And of course, as we know, it saved numerous lives through better and more precise diagnostics. But even though these scientists were motivated by care and concern in these early years, of course, to better diagnose disease, these scientists also inadvertently created the modern abstraction of the human body into clinical data. And I think severing empathetic pathways to the individual that has had profound consequences on our healthcare industry. And because it was birthed within physiology and not art, the pulse wave has remained as mere medical data in the public consciousness. And I think it has been overlooked both artistically and art historically as a significant innovation in the history of the expression of emotion through image and mark making. So laying dormant since the mid-19th century, tens of thousands of anonymous hearts have resided in medical books and archives as pulse waves. Now mostly useless by today's standards of diagnostic instruments, they nonetheless, I would argue, each represent a lived life and an untapped narrative of experiential and emotional knowledge that demands a different approach to their reading. And like the ghost heart, these people gave their hearts to science. And the way I look at it, they gave their hearts to us, to the future. And like all such gestures of giving your heart to another, there is zero guarantee it will be received or remembered unless we all agree to carry each other's hearts forward. The question is how to recover in more heartfelt ways the latent data embedded within these waveforms. And because these early subjects were often poor and sick and injured, their names were rarely recorded. But in each of these earliest waveforms is a person who lived and loved, felt fear and anger and excitement, all expressions of their humanity that I really believe should be resuscitated from obscurity. So in my own work, I want to completely upend our current ideas of data mining and inject our humanity back into these abstract signals. So keeping in mind Humboldt, the ghost heart, the pulse wave, and this deep concern about the unforeseen implications of severing art from science, I'd like to share this project that I've been working on for many years. And as I mentioned earlier, these early efforts of using the pulse wave technology was, of course, to document disease. And when one digs into these archives, as I have, it is an overwhelming experience to witness all of this past suffering, all these broken hearts and the ways that our bodies can fail us. But as I dug deeper into these archives, I started to notice something else, something that was clearly tangential to the main study of disease, but which seemed to hint at this tension between data and humanity that I mentioned. I started to notice that what I call these outlier recordings, outlier in the sense that these waveforms were not about disease, but instead about a heart simply living its life in all of its normalcy and even its mundaneity. For example, instead of whooping coughs or typhus, I found a tracing of a heart after having a glass of wine, or going for a long walk in the country, or even the first time a heart was recorded after somebody ate some chocolate. And then a challenge immediately presented itself to me. Through these outlier recordings, could I tell an alternate history of the first images of the heart, from birth to death, one in which we witness, as I said, a heart simply living its life? And it took me close to 5 years, but I finally tracked down 50 heart waves that weave together this alternate history of the heart and led to this piece entitled "The First Time the Heart, A Portrait of Life 1854 to 1913. It's a portfolio of 50 prints that also contains an essay about my research. And because I wanted to honor the original way that these tracings had been made, I worked with a phenomenal printmaking team called Island Press, who were more than game to try some really ambitious experimental printmaking techniques. Because our problem was this: how do we make a permanent print in soot from a candle flame? And as I mentioned, the scientists who originally made these recordings used single hairs as styluses and soot from candle flames. And they did this because of these materials' exquisite sensitivity in measuring the almost imperceptible movements deep within the body. And so after years of tracking down these original pulse tracings, we devised this complex and kind of ridiculously delicate procedure where we lithographed the waveform on paper with transparent ink. We then hand-sooted the paper with candle flames. We dipped this image into a fixative bath, often reminding me of Dr. Taylor's washing of hearts, and then excavated the line back out of the soot, sometimes even with paintbrushes that we made ourselves with single strands of hair. For time, I'm going to have to skip over several steps here, and I'm making this sound way easier than it actually was. But the part that I want to point out and that mattered to me the most was the excavation. And it's really hard to describe how emotional it was to perform this type of meditative surgery, retracing these century-old anonymous hearts, remembering them, feeling them, doing my best to pull them back from the brink of erasure. And it's a rather massive work when installed together. It's 50 different hearts from different times, different places, and different experiences. But together, they create one line, one heart, moving through time. And here are some of the prints and the varieties of experiences I was able to track down. You know, with all the ways that we excel at finding what's different about us, in these images, I think we can be reminded what we have in common. No matter who you are, it is quite likely your heart looks very similar when you're smelling lavender, just as this person in 1896, or having a draught of milk when you're having trouble sleeping. Somebody left their heart behind telling us that this happened, they did this. Or something oddly specific as this, which I just love. A young lady, 28, much debilitated by prolonged mental work, the entertainment of company, and the cares of a large household. These studies are really these documents, as I said, snapshots into lives we can all relate to. An ear lightly touched with a feather while sleeping. The first time a heart was recorded as they felt sadness from listening to a sung melody. Or the first time a mother was recorded in unison with her soon-to-be born child while still in utero. And as I mentioned, a lot of these people are forgotten, and in every case that I can, I do my best to remember and find out who these people were. And I point out two here, which I can't tell you their full stories, but these two people in particular are very important to me, and I'm working on some projects to fully tell their story again. And I also mentioned earlier that one of the goals of this work is to find new ways to tap into the latent emotional meaning within this abstracted data. And the prints allowed for a certain type of visual resurrection, but I also wanted to explore touch and sound, two other sensory experiences so crucial to how we know the heart. And what inspired this is that as we move a bit forward in time, when we find that although the initial studies were propelled by the study of disease, tentatively, these early physiologists did start to ponder the hidden materiality of love, fear, joy, and the myriad ways that we can express ourselves. A new field was even birthed in the process called emotionology. And this inspired a series of sculptures where I tracked down, like in the print project, all the very first instances of a heart being recorded under various emotional experiences, or while they were having dreams. And then through another complex technical process that I won't go over, I was able to turn these two-dimensional pulse waves into three-dimensional brass and steel sculptures, allowing one to literally carry the weight of another's heart through time. Each of these waveforms is so special with really heartbreaking stories behind them. And perhaps none more emotional to me than to be able to hold in my hands the first time a heart was recorded while someone experienced religious guilt in 1878. And I'm currently writing a book with my co-author, Jennifer Roberts, that will really highlight the story and tell it in its full complexity. And finally, as before I wrap up, I think one of the most provocative collaborations to come out of this work is with my friend and colleague, the media historian, Patrick Feaster. Feaster and his colleagues have revolutionized the way we think about historical sound. And he's devised a way to resurrect sound that was recorded before the actual invention of sound recording. And this is just mind-boggling and so exciting to me. And what I mean by this is that there are a couple of decades before Thomas Edison's groundbreaking invention of playback technology, where acoustic sciences had figured out how to visually record sound as waveforms. But their only objective at this point was to visually look at the waves afterwards. The notion of playing the sound back as we would understand it today was still many years away. But with custom designed software, Patrick has figured out a way to play back these pre-Edison sound waves, allowing us to hear, in his case, voices that were truly considered lost to time. And because the earliest heartbeat tracings were also essentially visual waveforms of sound, we can apply this approach to the early history of the heart, allowing us for the first time in history to literally hear hearts beating from the middle of the 19th century. And to date, we have resurrected a number of heart sounds, allowing us, I think, this new empathetic pathway to the past. And this work continues as we are challenging ourselves with just how far back in time we can pull fossilized sounds back from oblivion. And unfortunately, these sounds are incredibly difficult to hear through a computer speaker, or I'd play some for you, but instead, here is one way we have decided to present this piece in sculptural and audible form. And as you see here, it's also designed through research. The images that accompany each story, all of these sounds were also pressed to vinyl. But the key is that the viewers can read the story that accompanies this sound, but also, very importantly to me, they can hear it. And moving down through 6 different headphones, they can literally hear a heart moving through the 19th century. So actually see that I'm hitting my mark on time. So I'm going to end here, and hopefully we can take some questions. And I really want to thank everyone for taking the time out of your day to listen to this. And I hope this inspires you to see the show or to read Andrea's book. But most importantly, I hope it helps you to become more aware and sensitive to just what is at stake culturally for our society, or even just individually, when we are taught or forced to tidily separate science from art, or our emotions from our intellect. And I know I don't need to tell anyone that we are living in a pretty complicated historical moment that at its worst is distancing us. It's highlighting what is different about each other and eroding some of our most vital emotional tools, such as empathy and compassion. And as much as I love science, I know that some aspects of it, especially through certain technologies, are playing a crucial role in disrupting our emotional health. And we have to find a way, and I hope Humboldt is a good guide here, and I hope I can contribute in my own small way to find a way to balance the increasing technological upheavals we will face as a society with an equal call to arms of our poetic and emotional capabilities. We need the best of science and art working together, and we always have, and which I think makes Humboldt's ideas even more powerful and relevant today. So thank you so much for your time, and I hope we have some questions to look at.
Oh, we have questions.
Great.
And not surprisingly, Dario, we've got great philosophical questions. But
wonderful.
The one that I want to start with is more of an observation, which struck me. One of our listeners this afternoon remarked that when looking at the photograph of you helping to hold the ghost heart, it struck her as being a 21st century vision of Michelangelo's Sistine ceiling, where the rhythms of creativity are again being repeated.
Wow. Well, that's a high standard to meet. And I can't say I purposely posed it. It was a completely random shot. And I loved how our fingers were almost touching, but not quite.
Exactly.
Yeah.
No,
that's a great observation.
Totally spectacular.
Yeah.
We do have a question specifically. The ghost heart. Oh my God. I've been following your work for decades, and I'm always blown away by something that you're working on. And I remember when you had your SARF fellowship here, and you posed the question, what does it mean not to have a heartbeat? Because that was an optional add-on for the early artificial hearts, because they didn't really need one, but that's what we benchmark on. And I just remember going home that afternoon, just having to pick up the pieces of trying to even process that thought. And so the ghost heart, one of the questions that I would echo is, Dr. Taylor seems to be a really unusual person. And I'm wondering how often you run into scientists like her who are able to really understand in a really profound way what you think of about transcending their own discipline.
I'm so glad you asked that, because I get to brag about her a little more.
Okay.
So the small credit I will take is that I do my homework. And as I mentioned in my layout, I'm looking for certain types of things. And I love this model of the artist as the observer on the front lines of these types of technological or medical upheavals. And, I have the sensibility, I've done the work, as I said, to be more precisely know what's different about that ghost heart that is different than, the 100 other such experiments playing out on the heart today, all equally fascinating, but I don't think quite hit that transcendent level where, okay, she's crossed into philosophy, she's crossed into religion, she's crossed into ancient questions about consciousness and where it resides and where your identity is in your body. Just, she's like hitting every mark for me that intrigues me. And, I will say that I don't think it's a coincidence that she is the incredible, generous, open-minded, I would say, I often tell her, she meets sort of my criteria as an artist in her provocativeness and the questions she asked, but the thing she made is so beautiful.
Yeah.
It wasn't driven by aesthetics, it was driven by biological needs. And yet she made one of the most compelling and interesting things I've ever seen. But my point is that I don't think it's coincidental that the personality type that I've met in her is doing this type of work. And because you need to have certain other things in place to kind of go out that far on a limb. Yeah. And as I said, she's driven by these beautifully and noble reasons of saving lives. I mean, she is driven to save people's lives, and she's willing to go there, even if, as an artist, as much as I admire it, I'm also, I want us to be critical of it too. Like, is this okay? Like with a beatless heart, is that okay as a society? Are we cool with science saying the beating of your heart is optional? And in this case, the idea that we can continually upgrade our heart when necessary is at minimum worthy of our time to reflect on as a society outside of the science. So Dr. Taylor is really willing to have those conversations. And she's remarkable in that regard because she is an anomaly. I've met a lot of heart surgeons and they are truly brilliant, wonderful people, but they are not the most emotionally available people that I've met. And that's fine because I realize they've got to compartmentalize in some way. But Dr. Taylor, our conversations, it's like I'm talking to my best artist friend. She is not afraid to go there. And not only not afraid, but as I hope I've been arguing, she sees that it's necessary, that she can't answer all these other questions, that her work, whether she intended to or not, it's here. She provoked another set of questions. And other people need to ask them and talk about it. And to her credit, she's open to having that conversation.
Well, I mean, that's really the Humboldtian piece of what you're both doing. We've had a lot of questions, different iterations on the same kind of concern about how you reintegrate art and science. What happens when you reintegrate it? Is there a downside to trying to kind of homogenize that as opposed to, having it remain, multifaceted? And I guess the question that I would ask you that kind of wraps a lot of those together is, when you think about the fact that Humboldt is arguing for the blending of art and science, he says that scientists need to retain a sense of aesthetic wonder in the world, and artists need to know enough science to know what it is they're doing. And so I guess the setup question is, it seems to me that all of the people that you have collaborated with have either overtly or unconsciously striven for that kind of Humboldtian synthesis of art and the science. They sense that something is going to happen that is more than the sum of its parts.
Yes, it's true. I have enough of these collaborations now to start to even compare personality traits in them. And you're right. I mean, it's not a coincidence that I'm drawn to that personality type myself.
Yeah.
And I will say that in my, deep dive on Humboldt, not one of them has ever heard of Humboldt either. And it's been a joy to talk to them about it, but how I opened the talk, and Andrea, talks about in her book, some possible reasons why he's sort of fallen through the cracks in some sense, even though that's weird to say because he has a show at the Smithsonian about him, and you're helping to correct some of those things, at least in the US. And I think it's really important because, as I said, I want to know what I'm connected to.
Yeah.
I think these people that I work with are striving. They would love to know better context. Every time I've worked with a scientist, they've been surprised that an artist is interested, which then surprises me, and I think gives me a nice insight into the way our education system is set up in our country, in that it's not obvious that this is, transcendent, and that we need a philosopher involved, and we need an artist involved, and we need a heart surgeon involved. Anyway, my point is that I see that Humboldt's spirit has eroded to such a state that we have to do some real basic rebuilding here, like that, in the sense that the other side would even think that we'd be interested in what they're doing. And so I already come fully interested, obviously. And so we can move past that. But I've learned that I have to sort of build this framework with them to talk about their work in completely different ways than they're accustomed to or not allowed to. And that really saddens me that the sciences in general, whether explicitly or implicitly, sort of require one to repress some emotional or the outward expression of that. I know that they're having the feeling. So there's, expressing it, but then I'm arguing, but let's do something with it. Like, let's make it creative. What I'm trying to argue the most as an artist is that I'm arguing there are untapped new creative forms in that terrain that they are seeing in their emotional experiences. That there's something there that would, back over in the arts, trigger a new line of thought or a new technical method. And so I'm really big on getting down in the weeds in that way in their emotional experience, because I do look at them as the front line of new types of experiences that have creative potential.
Well, I remember talking to you about a project that you were working on in Houston at the Manil when you were working with the folks in neuroscience in Houston, and they wanted to chart brain waves when people were having aesthetic experiences. And I remember you're telling me that when you said to them, you can't do that in an MRI tube. You're going to have to take the probes out into an aesthetically sympathetic environment, and you figured out together how to do forgive me, a skull cap with the electrodes, and you were able to have people walk through one of your exhibitions and record the brainwave activity, and then begin to tease out by, you know, by sex, by age, by race, and begin to understand how the brain processes what we think of as an aesthetic and emotional reaction. And I know we don't have time to go into all of that today, but I guess it's my way of saying to our audience, oh my God, Google Dario's work, because it's a deep dive, it's amazing. And each one of those projects takes one of those core philosophical questions at the juncture of art and science and just kind of explodes it into this little universe.
Thank you.
I feel like I can't wait for this pandemic to release so that you and I can get together and we can go look through all of this stuff, because what year was the chocolate wavelength? Do you remember off the top of your head?
That was a rare, at least in the ones that I was searching for. I think it was 1912, maybe 1914. Yeah, that's the, oh no, it would have been 1912. Yeah, that kind of, to me, the golden period of this is 1853 to 1913.
That's amazing. That is just totally amazing. But just the fact that someone would think to take such, on the one hand, quotidian things and try to see if there was something unique or provocative about it is just really interesting. You know, to your point about losing Humboldt, Louis Agassiz in 1869 at the centennial mentioned that every school child in America had been taught by Humboldt, but he didn't know the name of his teacher. And that's how diffuse had it already begun, even though we hadn't lost his name. And it's Teddy Roosevelt in Yosemite in 1903 who is cranking on the American education system for separating the arts and sciences. And he says, we're only training specialists. We've given up on training people like Humboldt. And I think the work that I see you doing, though I'm delighted you're collaborating with Jennifer Roberts, that's the restitching together and the reintegration, I think, of the arts and the sciences, where it becomes ridiculous to think that we could ever function separate from each other.
That's what I want. I want it to feel ridiculous that we're not functioning together.
Well, you and I are on a mission together, and I think we've got Humboldt in our corner for that.
Yes, I am very thankful to have learned so much more about him through this show.
Oh my God, this has just been awesome. We could go on for days, and I would enjoy that, but I think we are going to have to sort of wrap this up at this point. So what I want to say to everyone here is, don't stop with this. Tell your friends they can come back and watch this when we get it cleaned up and put up online. And then next week, Tom Lovejoy is going to join us. He's a tropical biologist who used to work for the Smithsonian. He now does work with the United Nations. And he's really going to sort of think about Humboldt for the modern age, riffing off of, I think, some of the ideas that Dario has been talking about today, that Randy Griffin talked about last week, that Andrea has done, and that I've tried to pull together in this exhibition. And now what I'd really like to remind all of you is that, you know, as you know, the Smithsonian is a nonprofit organization, and we're able to share free digital content like this with you thanks to funding from generous supporters, many of whom are in our audience today. We'd like you to please consider showing your support with a donation. We've put a link to donate on our website down in the chat feature so that you can help out if you have the opportunity. And thank you again so much for being with us. Dario, thank you so much for once again just blowing my mind. I'm going to be thinking about ghost hearts, watching them beat in this beautiful, elegant, eloquent way, probably for the rest of the night.
Wonderful. I'm glad. Thank you for inviting me.
What a pleasure.
Okay. See you later.
All right.